Japanese mythology, gods, creation, heroes, and the living soul of Japan. Introduction, before the world had a name. Silence, darkness, before the world had a name, before the islands of Japan rose from the churning sea, before a single god looked upon the earth and called it good, there was nothing. Not even nothing, really, because nothing implies an absence, a void with edges. What preceded Japan's creation myth was something the ancient storytellers called chaos. Not disorder, not violence, but pure, undifferentiated potential. Heaven and earth, not yet separated. Light and dark, wound together like a thread with no beginning and no end. This state of pre-existence is where Japan's mythology begins. And it begins not with a bang, not with a word, not with a god speaking light into being, but with something quieter and stranger and more interesting. It begins with separation. The world comes into being, not because something is created, but because something is distinguished. The lighter rises, the heavier sinks, and in that simple physical act of sorting, in the way oil rises through water, in the way cream lifts from milk, the cosmos takes its first tentative shape. Welcome. I am so glad you're here. What we are about to explore together is one of the world's great mythological traditions, a tradition that is older than the nation of Japan as we know it, older than its written language, older than its imperial institutions, and yet so alive today that its objects are displayed at coronations, its shrines rebuilt in living ceremonies, its characters recognized by every schoolchild and revered by millions of worshippers. Japanese mythology is not a relic. It is not a historical curiosity. It is an active, breathing tradition that has shaped and continues to shape one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The country that gave us the bullet train and the tea ceremony, the video game and the haiku, the precision of Toyota and the aesthetics of Miyazaki. That country's foundational stories are the ones we are going to tell today. But before we begin telling stories, I want to spend a few minutes, just a few, on context. Because these myths exist in a context, and understanding that context will make the stories richer. The texts where these stories come from. Our primary sources are two ancient chronicles. The first is the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters, compiled in 712 CE under the direction of the Emperor Genmei. The Kojiki is the oldest surviving book written in Japan. It begins with the creation of the cosmos and ends with the reign of Empress Suiko in the early 7th century. It is part myth, part genealogy, part political legitimization, part poetry collection, a document that wears many faces simultaneously. The second source is the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicles of Japan, completed just 8 years later, in 720 CE. The Nihon Shoki covers similar mythological ground, but is written in a different style. More formal, more Chinese in its literary influences, more inclined to present multiple versions of the same story side by side and let the reader decide. Where the Kojiki feels intimate, almost oral, like someone telling you a story by firelight. The Nihon Shoki feels like a court document, comprehensive, careful, self-conscious. There are also the Fudoki, regional gazetteers compiled from the early 8th century, which contain local variations of myths and legends that sometimes differ significantly from the imperial court versions. The Fudoki remind us that mythology is never monolithic. It changes as it travels. Different communities, different regions, different political moments produce different versions of the same stories. Scholar's note. The Kojiki was compiled by Ono Yasumaro at imperial command. It was written in a complex mixed script. Chinese characters used partly for their meaning, partly for their sound, that makes it one of the most challenging texts in the Japanese literary canon to translate. The first modern English translation by Donald Philippi appeared in 1968 and remains a scholarly standard. What does this mean for us? It means we're not dealing with a single authoritative text, the way we might with the Bible or Homer. We're dealing with a rich, layered, sometimes contradictory tradition. When stories differ between the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, and they sometimes do, significantly, I'll note it. When local traditions add color and detail that the imperial chronicles omit, I'll bring that in too. The goal is not to give you one clean version of Japanese mythology. The goal is to give you the living, breathing, complicated reality of it. Now, on to the second thing I want to tell you before we begin. Shinto, the religion. These myths live. In Japanese mythology does not exist in an abstract space. It exists within, and has been shaped by, and has in turn shaped, Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan. Shinto is one of the world's oldest living religious traditions. Its name means, roughly, the way of the gods, kami no machi in Japanese. And the kami, the divine beings, are the central figures of both Shinto practice and Japanese myth. Understanding even a little about what kami means will change how you hear the stories we're about to tell. In Western religious traditions, the divine and the earthly are usually kept separate. God is transcendent, above, apart, fundamentally different from the physical world. The physical world is, depending on the tradition, either a fallen place or a place of testing, or both. But in Shinto, the divine is not separate from the physical world. It is present in it. Kami inhabit mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, animals, and people. The wind has a kami. The rice has a kami. A particularly ancient and gnarled tree might be recognized as having kami presence and wrapped in a sacred rope to mark it. The divine is not elsewhere. It is here, in the texture of the world itself. This means that the myths of Japan are not, at their core, about the human relationship with a transcendent creator. They are about the human relationship with a world that is itself alive, itself divine, itself continuously generating new forms of meaning and presence. The gods in Japanese mythology are not remote, perfect, philosophical absolutes. They weep, they rage, they make mistakes, they feel jealous and grief-stricken and triumphant and afraid. They are very, very human, because they are, in a deep sense, not separate from humanity at all. World mythology. This stands in fascinating contrast to both the Abrahamic traditions, where God is explicitly other, infinite, perfect, and even to ancient Greek mythology, where the gods are human-like, but explicitly set apart from mortals by their immortality and their residence on Olympus. The Japanese kami exist in a more permeable relationship with the human world, one in which the divine is not above, but within. The other Shinto concept we need before we start is misogi, ritual purification. Purity and impurity are central categories in Shinto thought, not in a moral sense, but in an energetic sense. Death, blood, illness, certain acts, these create kegare, a kind of spiritual contamination that disrupts the natural flow of divine energy. Misogi, purification through water, through ritual, through ceremony, restores that flow. You will see misogi in the creation myth, in the story of Amaterasu throughout. It is the engine of spiritual renewal in the Shinto world. All right. Context provided. Now, let's begin. At the very, very beginning. Chapter 1. The Creation. Myth, Izanagi and Izanami. Part 1. The Shapeless Beginning. The Cosmic Egg. In the beginning of heaven and earth, the Kojiki tells us, all was formless. The text uses an image that appears in creation myths from ancient India to ancient China. The universe as an egg, a primordial, undifferentiated mixture of all potential states of matter and energy, floating in darkness, not yet hatched into existence. What is interesting about this image is what it implies. If the universe is an egg, then it already contains everything that will ever exist, just not yet differentiated, not yet sorted, not yet separated into the distinct things that constitute the world as we experience it. Creation, in this telling, is not the making of something from nothing. Creation is the act of sorting, of distinguishing, of separating what is already latent within the whole. This is a profoundly different model of creation than the one most Westerners have inherited. In Genesis, God creates ex nihilo, from nothing. He speaks, and things come into being that were not there before. In Japanese cosmogony, Nothing is created from nothing. The cosmic material already exists. What changes is its arrangement. World mythology. The physicist might recognize something familiar in this. The Big Bang Theory does not posit creation from nothing exactly. It posits the expansion and differentiation of an initial state of extreme density. The Japanese creation myth is, in this respect, oddly resonant with modern cosmology. Not because the ancient storytellers had scientific knowledge, but because the pattern they intuited, chaos differentiating into cosmos, is a genuinely universal template for understanding origins. Gradually, the texts say, the lighter, purer elements rose and became the heavens. The heavier, denser elements sank and settled into what would eventually become the earth. This separation was the first act of the universe, not explosive or violent, but slow and gravitational, like sediment settling in still water. The Kotoa Matsukami, the first gods. From this act of cosmic separation, the first gods spontaneously appeared. The Kojiki names them carefully, 5 solitary deities, each distinct, each appearing in the newly differentiated heavens, and then, mysteriously, concealing their forms. They vanish from the narrative almost as soon as they appear. These are the Kotoa Matsukami, the separate heavenly deities. Their names carry cosmological meaning. Amenomi Nakanushi, Lord of the august center of heaven. Takami Musubi, High Creator. Kami Musubi, Divine Creator. They sound less like individuals and more like principles, like the universe naming its own operating procedures, creation, center, polarity. These forces exist, do their work, and step back. After the 5 solitary deities, 7 generations of paired deities emerge, male and female in combination, or in some cases ambiguous, each pair given names that often seem to describe aspects of the earth coming into form. Earth settling, mud curdling, root sprouting. The world is slowly taking shape, one divine generation at a time. And with each generation, the gods become slightly more concrete, slightly more anthropomorphic, slightly more like the passionate, complicated beings we're about to meet. Scholar's note: the concept of concealing their form, kakurimiara, yin rishen, is significant in Shinto thought. Many kami are understood to be present but invisible, detectable only through their effects, the way we feel wind without seeing it. The early creation deities might be understood as cosmic principles, whose concealment is their normal mode of existence. They are not absent. They are simply operating at a level below visibility. The last of these 7 generations produces 2 figures who will not conceal themselves. 2 gods who are given specific bodies, specific names, specific instructions, and a specific mission. The male, Izanagi no Mikoto. The female, Izanami no Mikoto. and with them the real story begins. Part 2. Izanagi and Izanami. The Jeweled Spear and the First Island. The heavenly gods looked down from above at the newly formed lower world. They could see it, drifting there below, like young water plants floating on the surface of a pond. Something almost like land, but not yet solid. A world in potentia waiting to be shaped. They called Izanagi and Izanami before them, and gave them their mission. The land below is not yet formed, the heavenly gods said. It drifts and wanders. Go down and make it solid. Complete it. Bring it into being. And with this charge they presented them with a magnificent object. The Ame no Nuboko, the heavenly jeweled spear. Not a weapon, despite the name, but an instrument of creation, long, jeweled, gleaming, a tool for reaching down into the waters of chaos and stirring something into existence. The two gods stood on the Ama no Ukihashi, the floating bridge of heaven. Let that image settle for a moment. A bridge floating in the sky between heaven and the primordial sea below. No ground at either end, just the bridge itself, suspended in the gap between the ordered divine realm and the still-forming lower world. This is a liminal space, a threshold space, neither one thing nor another. The perfect place to begin a creation. They thrust the spear downward into the ocean below and stirred. The sound of the sea churning around that cosmic spear, ko-wo-ro, is actually rendered onomatopoeically in the Kojiki. The ancient storyteller wanted you to hear it. The thick, wet, swirling sound of chaos being worked into something. When they lifted the spear, the brine dripped from its tip, and drop by drop, those drops of brine solidified as they fell, crystallizing, accreting, layer upon layer, until they formed an island. Onogoro, the first piece of solid ground in the history of the universe, built from the dripping of a spear. It rose from the sea like a mountain finding its footing. Scholars note, the name Onogoro, Zi Ningdao, means roughly self-curdling island, or the island that curdled itself. The image of brine crystallizing and solidifying is surprisingly accurate to the geological process by which oceanic islands actually do form. Volcanic matter solidifying as it is expelled from the ocean floor into cooler water. The ancient storytellers, of course, had no geology, but the poetic image they chose is not far from scientific reality. Izanagi and Izanami descended to this island. They built a pillar, the Ame no Mehashira, the august pillar of heaven, and around it, a magnificent hall. And here, in this palace at the center of the first island in the world, they became husband and wife, the birth of the islands. The union of Izanagi and Izanami was not simply a marriage. It was the operating mechanism of creation. Together, They became the generative force that produced the physical world, and the method was, in the Kojiki's telling, almost biological. They circled the pillar, Izanagi going one way, Izanami the other, met at the middle, spoke words of attraction and desire, and from their union the world was born. Their first child, born before the islands, was a failed creation, a boneless, weak child called Hiruko, the leech child. They set it adrift in a basket of reeds and let the sea take it. The heavenly gods consulted about why this first birth had gone wrong, determined that there had been a ritual error in the ceremony of meeting. Izanami had spoken first, rather than Izanagi. Female before male, when it should have been male before female. They corrected the error, performed the ceremony again, and this time the creation succeeded. World mythology. This element, the ritual error and correction, is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. It suggests a society already concerned with the proper ordering of ceremony, already aware that how you do something matters as much as what you do. It also, frankly, reflects the patriarchal values of the court society that commissioned these texts. But many scholars note that in some regional traditions, the female-speaking first version was not an error at all, that Izanami's priority was simply natural in older tellings. With the ritual corrected, the great births began. Awaji Island came first, then Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's 4 main islands, then Oki, the remote islands in the Sea of Japan, then Kyushu, the southwestern island, named in the myth for its 9 provinces, then Iki and Tsushima, the small islands between Japan and Korea, then Sado, and finally Yamato, Great Honshu, the central island, the largest of all, the Japanese archipelago, island by island, born from the bodies of gods. Then, having given birth to the land itself, they gave birth to the gods of nature, God of the sea, God of rivers, God of wind, Fujin, who would be depicted for millennia as a muscular figure carrying a bag of winds, a bag he is perpetually trying to keep closed. Gods of mountains, of trees, of grass, of earth, of stone, of autumn, of rain. Dozens of deities, each one an aspect of the natural world given divine personhood, given name and story, given the capacity to be invoked and honored and appeased. The world was taking shape. It was growing populated, textured, alive. And then came the birth that would end everything. The death of Izanami. Fire enters the world. The fire god's name was Kagutsuchi, or in other texts, Homusubi, he who sets fire. His very birth was an act of consuming his own mother. The flames of his divine body burned Izanami as she bore him. The burns were not simply painful, they were fatal. The goddess who had given birth to the islands of Japan, to the sea and mountains and rivers and wind, lay dying, burned from within by the child she had just brought into the world. Even in her dying, creation continued. From her vomit, as she retched in pain, new gods emerged, gods of metal, gods of clay. From her waste came more gods. From her urine came yet more. Even decomposing, even in agony, Izanami's body was still a source of new being. The Kojiki does not flinch from this. It records it carefully, clinically almost, this catalogue of gods born from suffering, as if the ancient storyteller wanted us to understand something about creation, that it is not clean, that it costs something, that the birth of the world was simultaneously the birth of death. And then she was gone. Izanami, the she who invites, the co-creator of the Japanese archipelago, the mother of the natural world, died, lay still, descended to Yomi. Izanagi sat beside her body and wept. His tears themselves became a god, Nakisawame, the crying swamp female, one of the minor deities of sorrow. And then his grief turned to rage. He looked at Kagutsuchi, this fire god, this child who had killed his mother in the act of being born, and he could not bear what he saw. He drew the Totsuka no Tsurugi, his 10-span sword, and he cut his own son into pieces. From the pieces of the slaughtered fire god, more gods were born. 8 gods from the blood that spattered from the blade. Gods from the head, the chest, the belly, the genitals, the left hand, the right hand, the left foot, the right foot. Even in dismemberment, even in furious, grief-driven murder, new gods, new aspects of the world. The Kojiki is telling us something about the nature of divinity. It cannot be destroyed. It transforms. It scatters. It becomes something else. But it persists, scholars note. Some scholars read the birth and death of Kagutsuchi as a mythological explanation for the volcanic activity that shaped the Japanese islands. Japan sits on the Ring of Fire and has been formed by volcanic forces over millions of years. The fire god born from the creative union of heaven and earth, who kills his own mother in being born. This image maps, metaphorically, onto the geological fire that both created and repeatedly devastated the land. But Kagutsuchi was dead, and Izanami was still in Yomi. And Izanagi made a decision that would define the rest of his story. He would go and get her back. The descent into Yomi, the first grief journey, Yomi no Kuni, the land of Yomi, the underworld of Japanese mythology. It is important to understand what Yomi is and what it is not. It is not a place of punishment. There is no judgment at the gates of Yomi, no weighing of souls, no assignment to paradise or torment based on the quality of a life lived. Yomi is simply where the dead go. It is dark, underground, and, as we are about to discover, fundamentally contaminating to the living. It is a place of kegare, of impurity, the source of the most fundamental pollution in the Shinto universe. the pollution of death. The fact that Izanagi went there anyway tells us everything about the depth of his grief. He descended into the darkness. We are not told how, through what passage, down what path, across what boundary. The Kojiki moves over this transition quickly, almost as if the passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead is less remarkable than what waits on the other side. He descended, and he found himself in darkness, and he called for Izanami. Her voice came back from the dark, distant, hollow, wrong in some way, that the text doesn't fully specify, but that you can feel in the telling. Her voice was there, but something was different. Something had changed in her. "My love," Izanagi said, "come back with me. The land is not yet complete. We have more to create, more to do. I need you. The world needs you." A pause. Then Izanami's voice, careful and measured. "I have already eaten the food of this land. I have become of Yomi. I may not be able to return, but do not come in. Do not follow me. Do not light your torch. Wait at the entrance. I will go to the gods of Yomi and ask if I may leave." He waited. The darkness was total. No stars, no moon, no flicker of any light, no sound except the distant movement of things he could not see and did not want to identify. He didn't know how much time was passing. In Yomi, there may be no time, or time may move differently, or cease to matter. He stood at the entrance to the underworld and waited for his wife to come back, and waited, and kept waiting. The Kojiki does not tell us how long he waited. Long enough that when he finally broke, when the silence and the darkness became more than he could endure, we do not judge him. We understand. Any of us would have done the same. He reached into his hair and took out the hair comb that held his hair in its knot. He broke off one of the teeth. He held it up and lit it. A small, trembling flame in the vastness of Yomi. The forbidden look, horror in the underworld, what he saw. The ancient texts do not soften this. They describe it with the clinical precision of a nightmare that has been recorded exactly because the recorder could not look away. Izanami's body was rotting. Her flesh was swollen and blackened with decomposition. Maggots moved through her, white and purposeful, going about the work of transformation that death always assigns to them. Her body was no longer a body in the sense Izanagi had known. It was becoming something else, returning to the earth that she had helped to create. And in each part of her, a thunder god. 8 thunder deities, each one having taken up residence in a different region of her decomposing body. Oikadzuchi in her head, Honoikadzuchi in her chest, Kuroikadzuchi in her belly, Sakuikadzuchi in her genitals, Wakaikadzuchi in her left hand, Tsuchikadzuchi in her right hand, Narikadzuchi in her left foot, Funikadzuchi in her right foot. 8 manifestations of divine thunderous power, each one inhabiting the body of the woman who had given birth to the world. Izanagi screamed. The Kojiki uses a specific word for the sound he made, a word that implies something beyond ordinary fear, beyond simple shock, something that goes down to the bone and changes you. He turned and ran, and Izanami woke. Or, and this is perhaps more accurate, she became aware of what had just happened. She felt the light. She felt the shame. She had told him not to look. She had known what she looked like, had known what the food of Yomi had made of her body, and she had wanted to spare him, or herself, or both of them, from the reality of her transformation. And now he had looked anyway, had seen her at her most vulnerable, her most hideous, her most irrevocably other. "You have shamed me," she said into the darkness behind him. Her voice was no longer careful, no longer measured. "You looked when I told you not to look. I will not forgive this." She sent the Shikome after him, the ugly women of Yomi, the female demons of the underworld, pursuers who knew this darkness better than any living thing. She sent the 8 thunder gods from her own body. She sent 1,500 demons of Yomi into the chase. Izanagi ran with everything he had. The chase through Yomi is one of the great action sequences in world mythology, and like all great action sequences, its tension comes not from the violence, but from the creativity it demands. Izanagi could not simply outrun the demons of the underworld on their home ground. He had to think. He pulled the black vine tying his hair and threw it behind him. It became a vine of black grapes, a fat cluster hanging in the dark. The Shikome stopped to eat. He pulled the comb from his hair, the very comb he had broken to make his torch, and threw it behind him. The teeth of the comb became bamboo shoots erupting from the ground. The demons stopped to eat those too. He was buying seconds. Each improvised obstacle, buying him a few more feet of ground, a few more seconds of distance from something that wanted to drag him down into the darkness permanently. He reached the even pass of Yomi, the slope leading back up toward the world of the living, and found, growing at its base, 3 peaches on a tree. He seized them and hurled them at his pursuers. The peaches struck and the demons fled, all 1,500 of them, back into the depths they had come from. Modern Japan. The apotropaic power of peaches, their ability to repel evil, became a fixture of Japanese folk tradition. Momotaro, one of the most beloved characters in Japanese folklore, is literally Peach Boy, a hero born from a peach who battles demons. The same fruit that Izanagi used against the demons of Yomi echoes across Japanese culture for thousands of years. But the greatest barrier was still to come. Izanami herself appeared at the entrance to Yomi. No longer the gentle goddess, no longer the careful voice in the darkness, but something transformed by death and fury and shame. Izanagi gathered all his remaining strength and heaved an enormous boulder, the Chigaishi no Okami, across the entrance to Yomi, the great god of road turning back. This boulder sealed the passage between the living world and the dead one, and it stands there still, the ancient storytellers say, somewhere in the land, the boundary between what lives and what has died. They faced each other across that stone, two gods who had created the world together, who had stood on the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the primordial sea with a jeweled spear, who had given birth to the islands and the mountains and the seas, separated now by a rock that neither of them could move. Izanami's voice came through the stone, cold and inevitable. If you do this, if you leave me here, if you seal this entrance and go back to the world without me, I will take 1,000 lives from your land, every single day, 1,000 people dead by my hand. Izanagi's voice came back without hesitation. Then I will cause 1,500 to be born, every single day, 1,500 new lives to answer your 1,000 deaths. Silence. And that, the ancient texts tell us with quiet confidence, is the explanation for the fact of human mortality, and for the fact that despite mortality, humanity persists and grows. Death takes 1,000. Life makes 1,500. The gap between those two numbers, that small daily surplus of births over deaths, that is why we are still here. World Mythology. This exchange between Izanagi and Izanami at the sealed entrance to the underworld is one of the most compressed and powerful cosmological explanations in world mythology. Compare it with the Book of Genesis, where death enters the world through disobedience and sin, with Sumerian mythology, where the goddess Inanna must die and be reborn for the world to remain fertile, with Norse mythology, where death and rebirth are built into the very architecture of the cosmos. In every case, the story is trying to answer the same question: why do we die? Japan's answer is because a goddess in the underworld is taking 1,000 lives a day. And the only reason we survive her is that life itself is more prolific than death. The purification, 3 great children from water. Izanagi emerged from the underworld into the world of the living, and immediately felt what any contact with Yomi produces in the Shinto understanding: kagare, impurity, contamination. He had been in the place of the dead, had seen decomposition, and been chased by demons. He was not physically hurt, but spiritually, energetically, he was polluted in a way that had to be cleansed. He went to the river, the Ahaji no Woto, some texts say, a river in what is now Kyushu, and began the ritual of misogi. He stripped off his clothes, Each garment and accessory, as it was removed, became a new god, 12 in total, embodying aspects of illness and purification, and the boundary between the living and the dead. Even in this act of cleaning himself of Yomi's pollution, Izanagi's body was generating new divine beings. Then he washed. He dipped beneath the water. And from the act of washing himself, from specific physical acts of purification on his own body, 3 gods emerged who would become the axis of Japanese civilization. He washed his left eye, and from the water that touched his left eye, Amaterasu Omikami was born, the great divinity illuminating heaven, the sun herself. He washed his right eye, and from the water there, Tsukuyomi no Mikoto emerged, the count of the moon, the god of the night sky. He washed his nose, and from that water came Susanoo no Mikoto, the impetuous male, the god of storms. Izanagi looked at these 3 children and felt something he had not felt since before his journey to Yomi. Joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. He called them the Mehashira no Uzumiko, the 3 precious children. He took his necklace, the string of jewels that had hung around his neck since the beginning of creation, and placed it around Amaterasu's neck. "You will rule the high plane of heaven," he told her. To Tsukuyomi, "You will rule the realm of night." To Susanoo, "You will rule the seas." Then, the Kojiki tells us with some pathos, Izanagi is not much heard from again. He had done his great work. He had created the land, mourned his wife, survived the underworld, and produced 3 radiant children. He retreated to a realm called Ahaji, or in some texts Awa, and remained there in a kind of divine retirement. His story was, in the deepest sense, complete. But his children's stories were just beginning. Chapter 2. Amaterasu, Queen of the High Plane of Heaven. Part 1. The Sun, Goddess and Her Domain. Why Amaterasu matters. Before we tell Amaterasu's story, we need to understand what she represents, because she is not simply the sun, in the way that Apollo is the sun, or Ra is the sun. She is something more layered and more interesting than that. Amaterasu is the ancestral deity of the Japanese imperial family. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic description. It is a claim that was taken literally, politically, legally, spiritually, for most of Japanese history, and that continues to have formal ceremonial acknowledgement today. The Emperor of Japan, in the Shinto tradition, is a direct descendant of Amaterasu, separated from her by dozens of generations, but connected by an unbroken genealogical line. What this means practically is that the story of Amaterasu is also the story of the legitimacy of Japanese imperial governance. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were commissioned by the imperial court not simply as literary or religious projects, but as political documents. They were establishing, in sacred narrative form, the divine origin and divine right of the imperial line. Amaterasu is the source of that line. Her character, her choices, her attributes reflect, and were deliberately shaped to reflect, the ideal of divine sovereignty. She is also the center of Japan's most important religious site. The grand shrine of Ise, in what is now Mie Prefecture, is dedicated to Amaterasu. It is the holiest site in Shinto, receiving millions of pilgrims each year, and it has been a pilgrimage destination for well over 1,000 years. The shrine complex is rebuilt entirely every 20 years, a practice called Shikinen Sengu, which we will return to at the end of this video. It is not simply a shrine dedicated to a sun deity. It is the spiritual home of Japanese civilization's most fundamental claim about itself, that the land and its people stand in a special relationship with the divine light. Modern Japan. The most recent Shikinen Sengu, the ritual rebuilding of Ise Grand Shrine, took place in 2013 and will occur again in 2033. The ceremony involves over a decade of preparation, including the planting and harvesting of specific sacred cypress trees. At its conclusion, a procession of priests transfers the divine presence of Amaterasu from the old shrine to the new one, in a ceremony conducted entirely in darkness. Even the emperor participates, formally announcing the transfer. It is one of the most elaborate and expensive religious ceremonies conducted anywhere in the modern world. The realm of heaven. What Amaterasu built, the high plane of heaven, as Amaterasu ruled it, was not a passive paradise. It was a working kingdom. The Kojiki is careful to show us Amaterasu as an active administrator, not a passive symbol. She cultivated sacred rice paddies, the Tanada, the terraced fields that are still one of the defining visual elements of the Japanese landscape. She oversaw the divine weaving halls where cloth was made. These might seem like mundane activities for supreme deity, but in the context of ancient Japanese civilization, they were anything but mundane. Rice cultivation was the foundation of the economy, the calendar, the social structure, and the religious year. The planting and harvesting of rice was itself a sacred act, connected to the divine and governed by ritual. When Amaterasu grows rice in heaven, she is modeling the correct relationship between human beings and the land. The attentive, productive, reciprocal relationship between people and the forces that sustain them. Similarly, cloth making. The weaving of cloth was, in ancient Japan, women's sacred work, work connected to the divine feminine, to fertility, to the ordering of the world. Amaterasu's weaving hall is a site of divine labor that mirrors the labor of human women. The goddess does not only reign, she works, alongside her attendants, at the same crafts that sustain civilization. This is an Amaterasu who is not distant and transcendent, but immediate and engaged. She is in the fields. She is in the weaving hall. She is managing, organizing, producing. And it is this engaged, attentive quality that makes what her brother does to her domain so particularly devastating. Part 2. Susanoo's Crisis and the Catastrophe. The god who could not stop weeping. Susanoo had been given the seas to rule. He had been handed dominion over one of the most powerful forces in the natural world. The oceans that surround Japan, that both protect it and threaten it, that bring fish and trade winds and occasionally devastating typhoons. This was not a small assignment. But Susanoo could not do it. He would not do it. He sat in his appointed realm and wept, and his weeping was not quiet or contained. It was cosmic. His grief shook the mountains. The sound of his mourning was so vast and so raw that it withered the forests on the hillsides. The seas he was supposed to govern instead took on the character of his internal state, churning, unpredictable, violent. Evil spirits were drawn to the disorder his grief created, and they ran wild across the earth, causing plague and drought and disaster. What was he mourning? His mother, Izanami, who had died giving birth to the fire god who lay in the darkness of Yomi. Susanoo had never known her. He had been born from his father's purification ritual, after Izanami was already dead and sealed away. He had lost her before he ever had her, and yet the loss was real, perhaps more real in some ways, for its totality. You cannot grieve someone you knew. You can only grieve what you never had. Izanagi appeared before his inconsolable son and confronted him. Why will you not rule as I commanded? Why does the world suffer for your grief? And Susanoo said with terrible simplicity, I don't want the seas. I want to go to my mother. I want to go to the land of Yomi. This was not acceptable. Izanagi, who had himself descended to Yomi and barely escaped, who had sealed the entrance with a boulder and accepted the divorce of the living world from the dead one. He would not send his son to Yomi. He would not hear this wish. He banished Susanoo from his domain and from his presence. If the seas mean nothing to you, then go. Leave this realm. You are no longer welcome here. Susanoo accepted the banishment, but he needed, before leaving, to say goodbye to his sister. The contest, a trial of intentions. As Susanoo began his ascent to the high plane of heaven, the mountains and seas registered his approach with violence. The divine world responds to the emotional state of its deities. The physical world is not separate from the psychological one. Susanoo's grief turned resolve, turned uncertainty, manifested as geological upheaval. Amaterasu felt it. She knew her brother was coming, and she was afraid. Not the abstract fear of a distant threat, but the immediate, tactical fear of a ruler who suspects invasion. She had watched what Susanoo's grief had done to the world below. She knew the scale of his power uncontrolled. Was this an assault? Was he coming to take her realm from her? She prepared for war. She bound her hair up into the warrior's style, into knots at either temple, the way a fighting man would wear it. She slung a quiver of 1,000 arrows across her back. She took up a bow. She let her presence expand to fill the approach to heaven. Enormous, radiant, armed, waiting. When Susanoo arrived at the boundary of heaven, she was already there. State your purpose. Speak clearly. Why have you come here? Susanoo protested his innocence with evident frustration. I come to say goodbye. I have been banished, and I will go. But I wanted to see you first, and my heart is clear. I am not here to take anything from you. But how does a god prove that his heart is clear? How does anyone prove that their intentions are pure? They struck an agreement, a divine contest, a trial by creation. They would produce gods together, and the nature of those gods would reveal whose intentions were what they claimed to be. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, the 10-span blade, broke it into 3 pieces, chewed the pieces and breathed mist. 3 goddesses emerged from that mist. 3 divine women, born from Susanoo's sword but created by Amaterasu's creative act. She declared them hers. Susanoo took Amaterasu's jewels, the necklace their father had given her, washed them, chewed them, and breathed mist. 5 gods emerged. 5 divine men, born from Amaterasu's jewels but created by Susanoo's breath. He declared them his. Both claimed victory. Both could make an argument for it. The Kojiki, unusually, does not fully adjudicate between them. Different scholars read the contest differently. What matters for the narrative is what Susanoo does next. Scholars note, the three goddesses born from Susanoo's sword during this contest are Takiribime, Ichikishima Hime, and Takitsu Hime. They are venerated today at the Munakata Grand Shrine in Fukuoka Prefecture, one of the most sacred sites in Japan. The shrine complex, on 3 islands in the sea between Japan and Korea, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017. The islands themselves are so sacred that women are prohibited from landing on the main island, and even male visitors must undergo a purification ritual in the sea before setting foot on land. The rampage. Perhaps it was the vindication. Perhaps the sense that he had been proven right, that his intentions were pure, that his sister had doubted him unfairly, released something in Susanoo that had been held under pressure for too long. Whatever the cause, what followed was a sustained, systematic destruction of everything Amaterasu had built. He filled in the irrigation channels of her sacred rice paddies. He broke down the dividing boundaries between the fields. He scattered his own excrement through the halls where she held her most sacred ceremonies. He desecrated what was holy. He destroyed what had been carefully cultivated. And still, when Amaterasu first heard of it, she tried to find excuses for him. Perhaps, she said, he didn't mean to fill in the channels. Perhaps he thought it was more efficient. Perhaps the boundary breaking was an accident. Perhaps he didn't realize what he was doing in the sacred hall. She was trying, with what we might today call magical thinking, to hold the narrative together, to keep her brother's action within the realm of misunderstanding rather than malice. Then he flayed a horse. He took a piebald horse, a horse of mixed white and dark coloring, which in Japanese tradition has specific sacred associations. And he stripped the skin from it while it was alive. He carried the flayed carcass to the roof of the sacred weaving hall, broke open the roof, and hurled it inside. The weavers inside reacted in panic and chaos, as anyone would when a flayed horse comes through the roof. In the chaos, one of Amaterasu's devoted weaving maidens, a young woman who had dedicated her life to service in the divine hall, was fatally injured, struck by her own shuttle in the confusion of bodies and terror. In some versions of this story, it is Amaterasu herself who is injured, who strikes her own thigh with the shuttle in her panic. In others, the maiden is the one who dies. The texts diverge on this point, but the result in both tellings is the same. Amaterasu stopped making excuses. The damage was not a misunderstanding. The grief was not a justification. Her brother, for whatever reason, entitlement, release, the despair of a god who had never been given what he needed, had deliberately destroyed the things she had made and had caused the death of someone under her care. She was frightened, not of Susanoo directly, but of something deeper, of the uncontrollable, of the darkness that exists even in people you love, of the way grief can transform into violence without anyone noticing the moment of transformation. She had spent her existence maintaining light and order and cultivation, and she had just watched all three be unmade in an afternoon. She withdrew. The Ama no Ewato, Heaven's Rock Cave, the Ama no Ewato. Heaven's Rock Cave. Amaterasu retreated into it, and she pulled the stone door shut behind her, and the world went dark. Not the ordinary dark of night, which has its own beauty and its own light, the moon, the stars, the quiet luminescence of a world resting. This was something else, a darkness without gradation, without relief, without any suggestion that light had ever existed or would ever exist again. The sun had hidden herself. The source of all warmth and growth and orientation had gone somewhere the world could not follow. The Kojiki describes the consequences with escalating horror. The forests died. The crops failed. The seasons stopped functioning. No planting season. No harvest season. Just undifferentiated cold and dark, and the sound of things dying. And into this darkness came the evil spirits that Susanoo's grief had first stirred, now multiplied, emboldened, filling the emptiness left by the absence of light. They were everywhere. Their shrieks and their destructive energy went unchecked. The world was unraveling. The Yaoyorozu no Kami, the 8 million gods, a number meaning countless beyond counting. Every divine being in existence gathered in council on the bank of the Ame no Yasukawara, the tranquil river bank of heaven. What could they do? The sun goddess had sealed herself inside a mountain. You cannot command a goddess. You cannot threaten her. You cannot argue her back into the world. They had to invite her. They had to make her want to come out. The dance, comedy, and the sacred. The gods devised a plan, or rather a kind of elaborate theatrical production. They hung the Yata no Kagami, the great 8-span mirror, in the branches of a sacred sakaki tree near the cave entrance. They draped the tree with jewels, with cloth of white and blue, with offerings accumulated from every corner of heaven. They brought roosters and set them crowing in the dark, as if conjuring a dawn. And then they asked Ame no Uzume to perform. Ame no Uzume is one of the most interesting figures in Japanese mythology, the goddess of dawn and of revelry and of the arts of performance. She is not a warrior, not a ruler, not a creator in the way Izanagi and Izanami are creators. She is something rarer and more subversive. She is a performer. And what she performed on that night outside the sealed cave changed the world. She climbed up onto an overturned wooden tub, a makeshift stage in the darkness outside Heaven's rock cave. And she began to dance. The dance began ritually, formally, the kind of sacred dance that might be performed at a shrine ceremony. But as the drumming picked up, and the gods watched, and the darkness pressed in from every side, something happened to the dance. It became something else. It became frenzied, ecstatic, improvisational, Ame no Uzumi's body moving in ways that went far beyond the formal ritual. Her robes loosened. Her movements grew wilder. She was, some scholars say, enacting a kind of divine possession, a trance state in which the boundaries between the human and the divine, between the sacred and the profane, between the cosmic and the comedic, completely dissolved. And the 8 million gods started laughing. A great, rolling, enormous, irrepressible laughter shook the high plane of heaven. The sound of countless divine beings overcome with uncontrollable mirth. In the middle of the greatest crisis the cosmos had ever faced, resonated across every corner of the divine realm. The absurdity of it. A goddess dancing with wild abandon in the pitch dark outside a sealed cave while civilization collapsed was apparently just too much to contain. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it, and she was confused. She had retreated from a world in crisis. She had sealed herself away from grief and violence and fear. And what was happening outside her door was not the sound of a world suffering. It was the sound of laughter. Raucous, unstoppable, joyful laughter. How was this possible? How could there be laughter when the world was dark? Scholars note, the dance of Ame no Uzume is understood by many scholars to be the mythological origin of Kagura, the sacred dance that remains a living tradition in Shinto ceremonies throughout Japan today. Kagura performances are held at shrines during festivals, and they often incorporate elements of comedy alongside solemnity, echoing the original performance that brought the sun back to the world. The tradition has been unbroken for over 1,000 years. She moved to the stone door, opened it the smallest crack, just enough to peek out, just enough to ask, why? And in that moment, everything happened at once. Ame no Takeru, the strong-armed god who had been hiding flat against the rock face beside the door, coiled and waiting for exactly this moment, seized Amaterasu's hand, pulled. She stumbled out into the open, and before she could recover her balance and pull back, a rope, the Shimenawa, the sacred rope, was stretched across the cave entrance. The door was sealed from the outside. There was no going back in. But Amaterasu wasn't thinking about going back in. She was staring at the sakaki tree. In the branches of that tree hung the Yata no Kagami, the great mirror, and in it she saw reflected back a figure of such radiance, such divine intensity, such overwhelming presence, that she could not look away. She was transfixed, awestruck. She had never seen anything like this, had never understood, perhaps, quite what she was, what she looked like, what she had always been. She was looking at herself for the first time. In that moment of transfixed self-recognition, the world was flooded with light. The darkness dissolved. The evil spirits fled before the returning sun. The crops would grow again. The seasons would resume their cycle. Everything that had been interrupted was restored. The 8 million gods cheered. Modern Japan. The sacred mirror in this story, the Yata no Kagami, is one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, the most sacred objects in the Shinto tradition. It is believed to reside today within the innermost sanctum of the grand shrine of Ise, where it has been kept for over 2,000 years. It has never been publicly displayed. Even the Emperor of Japan is not permitted to view it directly. He sees only the box it is kept in. When it was moved during the most recent Shikinen Sengu ceremony in 2013, it was transported by priests in total darkness, wrapped in silk, its form never exposed to direct light or direct sight. The judgment of Susanoo. With Amaterasu back in her rightful place, the assembled gods turned to the cause of the catastrophe. Susanoo was tried. The judgment was not gentle. He was fined. An enormous number of objects extracted from him as punishment. His beard was cut off. His fingernails and toenails were pulled out. These acts might seem symbolic to us, but in the divine context, they represent a real diminishment, a stripping away of divine power and status. A god with his beard cut and his nails removed is a god who has been made lesser, made more mortal, made more human, and then he was expelled from the high plane of heaven permanently, cast down to the earth below to find whatever existence he could among the mortal world. He fell to earth in the province of Izumo, and here something unexpected happened. The god who had destroyed sacred fields and defiled holy halls and driven the sun into hiding arrived on earth and found himself at the beginning of a different story. A story not of destruction, but of redemption. Not of grief turning into violence, but of violence turning into protection. Not of the storm God ruining what others had built, but of the storm God becoming the thing that stands between the helpless and what would consume them. His story was not finished. It was, in a strange way, just beginning. Chapter 3. Susanoo in Izumo, The Serpent and the Sword. Part 1. The Land of Izumo. A god among mortals. Izumo is one of the oldest named regions in Japan, a province along the Sea of Japan coast in what is now Shimane Prefecture. Even by the time the Kojiki was compiled in the early 8th century, Izumo had a distinct mythological identity. It was the land of Susanoo, the land of his descendants, the land of Okuninushi, the great deity who would eventually rule the entirety of the earth before surrendering it to the heavenly gods. Izumo is, in the geography of Japanese mythology, the counterpoint to heaven, the earthly realm, rich and ancient and complex, with its own traditions and its own claims on the divine. Susanoo arrived there stripped of his heavenly privileges, beard cut, nails pulled, diminished by punishment and exile. He was still a god, still more than mortal, but he was a god without a domain, without a role, without a purpose. He had spent his divine existence in grief over a mother he'd never met, in rage over a kingdom he didn't want, in destruction that had gained him nothing. He was, in the most literal sense, lost. He walked until he reached the headwaters of the high river, the Fire River, in the mountains of Izumo. And there, floating downstream on the current, he saw a pair of chopsticks, wooden, ordinary, completely unremarkable. And yet, to someone with divine perception, to someone who understood what the presence of chopsticks implied, completely extraordinary. Chopsticks mean a meal. A meal means a household. A household means people. He followed the river upstream. The family at the river. He found them at the bend of the river, a man named Ashinazuchi, a woman named Tenazuchi, and between them a young woman of striking beauty named Kushinada Hime. All three were weeping, but it was the particular weeping of people who have wept so long that the tears are almost automatic now. Not fresh grief, but grief worn into the body like a groove. Susanoo approached and asked the simple question, "Why?" The old man's answer came slowly, as if each word cost him something. He had been, past tense, the father of 8 daughters. They had been a family of 10. And every year, in the autumn, a great serpent came down from the mountains. Every year it took 1 daughter. This had been happening for 7 years. 7 daughters were gone. Only Kushinada Hime remained. And tonight is the night, the old man said. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The family was not praying for a miracle. They were simply sitting with the fact of what was coming, because they had learned that miracles did not come for them. They had prayed, presumably, for the 7 daughters before this one, and each time autumn came, and the serpent came with it, and another daughter was gone. They were doing the only thing left, being together, being present for what could not be prevented. Susanoo listened to all of this. Something in him was still. The man who had wept enough to wither mountains understood something about this family's grief that perhaps no other god in heaven could have understood. He had lost a mother. They had lost 7 daughters. There is a point at which grief becomes so large that it is simply the climate you live in. And he recognized that climate in them. He said, "I will kill the serpent, but you must give me Kushinada Hime as my wife." The old couple stared at this stranger, this wandering god with a military bearing and grief behind his eyes. There was no reason to trust him. There was also nothing left to lose. Susanoo told them who he was. Susanoo no Mikoto, brother of Amaterasu, son of Izanagi, a god exiled but still divine. And the old couple believed him, or believed in the impossibility of the alternative, and agreed. Part 2. Yamato no Orochi, the monster, an ancient force of nature. We should talk about what Yamato no Orochi actually is. The name means 8-branched great serpent. Ya for 8, Mata for branch or fork, Orochi for great serpent, But the numbers here are not literal. In ancient Japanese, 8 was a number that meant vast, uncountable beyond ordinary measure. 8 valleys, 8 hills, 8 heads, 8 tails. What the myth is describing is a serpent so enormous that it constitutes a landscape. Its body stretched across multiple mountains simultaneously. Forests grew on its back. Its belly was perpetually red and inflamed, as if something inside it was always burning. What was Yamato no Orochi? There are different ways to read the myth. At the most literal level, it is a monster, a supernatural predator that had established dominance over a region through its annual harvest of human life. At a mythological level, it may represent the kind of recurring natural disaster. Flood, perhaps, the high river overflowing catastrophically each autumn, that ancient people understood as a divine or demonic force. There is good reason to think the Orochi story is associated with flooding. The high river, the fire river, runs through the Izumo region and historically flooded severely in the autumn. The serpent comes every autumn. Its blood, when Susanoo kills it, turns the river red. The name of the river itself, High Fire, may encode an ancient cultural memory of something violent and consuming that came seasonally. The serpent may be the flood, given form and face, and the kind of narrative logic that makes catastrophe comprehensible. World mythology. The association of serpents with rivers and floods is nearly universal in world mythology. The Mesopotamian Tiamat is a sea dragon associated with chaos and primordial water. The Egyptian Apophis is the serpent of chaos that threatens to swallow the sun. The Chinese dragon is inextricably connected to rivers, rain, and the control of water. The Greek Typhon is a serpent monster associated with devastating storms. In almost every case, the serpent is the force that cannot be controlled, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be appeased, only defeated. Susanoo's encounter with the Orochi places him squarely in this universal mythological tradition of the hero who brings the uncontrollable under control. Whatever its original referent, in the myth as we have it, Yamato no Orochi is exactly what it appears to be. A monster, enormous, ancient, hungry, powerful, and cunning. The sake trap, intelligence over force. Susanoo's strategy was, at its core, disarmingly simple. He would not fight the Orochi in direct combat, not with a sword against 8 heads, not in the darkness of an autumn night on unfamiliar ground. He would use the serpent's own appetites against it. he transformed Kushinadahime into a fine tooth comb, the kind used to dress hair, and placed her in his own hair for safekeeping. This is one of those mythological details that seems almost comically impractical until you understand what it means symbolically. The beloved is carried within the self of the protector. She is not hidden away at a distance. She is part of him, carried with him, inseparable from him in the moment of danger. It is an image of intimacy so complete that the boundary between self and beloved dissolves. Then he gave his instructions to Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi. Build a fence with 8 gates. At each gate, build a platform. On each platform, place a large vat. Fill each vat with sake, but not ordinary sake. Brew it 8 times. 8 separate fermentations, each one starting from the product of the last, producing a drink of extraordinary potency, a sake so strong that ordinary human senses couldn't hold it, a sake that would reduce the divine to helplessness. Then wait. The night came. The mountains trembled. The river darkened. The air filled with the presence of something immense. And then 8 heads appeared above the tree line. 8 pairs of burning red eyes catching the firelight. 8 long necks swaying as they moved down the mountainside toward the valley that had fed them for 7 years. And then the heads caught the smell of the sake. 8 times brewed sake, the vapors of it rising in the autumn air, warm and sweet and impossibly inviting. The Yamato no Orochi, this ancient force of nature, this creature of valleys and mountains and centuries of unchallenged dominance, stopped, 8 heads swaying, tasting the air. Then, one by one, each enormous head lowered itself over one of the 8 vats and began to drink. The Orochi drank. The divine sake was unlike anything it had tasted in its long existence. Warmth spread through each of its 8 heads. The burning in its belly that was always there became a different kind of warmth. Not hunger, but satiation. Not violence, but ease. The red eyes clouded. The vast body, stretched across the valleys of Izumo, began to relax, to settle, to slow. And Yamato no Orochi, terror of the Izumo region, annual devourer of daughters, fell asleep. All 8 heads at once. The monster slept. The battle and the hidden sword Susanoo did not wait. He drew his sword, the Totsuka no Tsurugi that he had carried since heaven, and began. Head after head, tail after tail, the great serpentine body, stretched across 8 valleys, came apart under his blade. The blood ran into the high river and turned it red, And people still say, looking at the high river today, that the water carries a reddish tint from the blood of the Orochi that Susanoo spilled there in the age of the gods. He worked his way through the creature methodically, section by section, from the heads through the body toward the tails. 8 heads, 8 tails. The math was simple, the execution was not. This was not fighting a monster in the darkness and hoping for the best. This was a controlled operation, conducted against a sleeping target, still requiring a god's strength and precision to accomplish. And then he reached one of the middle tails. The text specifies the middle tail, though a creature with 8 tails has no single middle, and his sword struck something hard. The blade rang, not the sound of flesh or bone, but of metal against something harder than metal. The edge notched, chipped, as if it had struck stone. Susanoo stopped. He cut more carefully, pulling back the scales and the muscle of the tail, cutting through it slowly, section by section, with the concentrated attention of someone who has found something unexpected in exactly the place where nothing should be. And inside the tail, wrapped and protected within the body of the serpent as if it had always been there, as if the monster had been its sheath for all the centuries of its existence, was a sword. It was unlike any sword Susanoo had ever seen. The quality was beyond what mortal smiths could produce, beyond what even divine smiths typically achieved. It had a presence, a weight and a luminosity that suggested something more than excellent craftsmanship. It was a sword that had been in the world for a very long time, that had carried with it the accumulated power of its waiting. Susanoo held it with reverence. He understood, with the instinct of a divine being encountering something that operates at a different register than the ordinary, that this was not a sword he should keep. It was not his to claim. It needed to go to Amaterasu, both as a gift and as an acknowledgement, a brother's gesture of reconciliation after the catastrophe he had caused. Scholar's note: the sword found in the Orochi's tail has several names in different texts. Futsu no Mitama in some accounts, Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven, in others. It would later be renamed Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, in the adventures of Yamato Takeru. It is one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, said today to reside at Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, where it has been kept for over 2,000 years. Like the mirror at Ise, it has never been publicly displayed. Its precise form is unknown even to the priests who tend it. Part 3. Susanoo Reborn, the poet of Izumo. He retrieved Kushinada Hime from the comb in his hair, transforming her back into her true form. He looked at her. She looked at him. The monster was dead. Her family was safe. The high river was already carrying the last of the Orochi's blood toward the sea. And the god who had come from nowhere and kept his promise stood before her with a legendary sword in one hand and, perhaps for the first time in his divine existence, nowhere particular to be and nothing urgent to destroy. They were married. And in the act of settling into this new life, in the searching for a place to build their home, in the looking around at the landscape of Izumo with fresh eyes, something extraordinary happened. Susanoo was moved to poetry, the storm god, the weeper of world-withering grief, the destroyer of sacred paddies and holy halls, the exile from heaven. This god looked around at the clouds rising over the mountains of Izumo, felt what it was to have arrived somewhere, truly arrived, for the first time, and composed a poem. 8 clouds arise, he said. 8 clouds rising over the mountains of Izumo. And I build an 8-fold fence of clouds, this many-layered fence, to shelter my young bride within it. Oh, what a many-layered fence! The poem is called the 8 Rising Clouds Poem, Yakumo Tatsu, and scholars consider it the first waka poem in Japanese history, the form of Japanese poetry that would eventually produce some of the greatest literature in any language, the tanka, the renga, the haiku, traces its ancestry back to this storm god, standing in a new landscape, overwhelmed by a feeling he had no word for yet, and arranging 31 syllables in a way that made the feeling visible. Think about what that means. The first poem in Japanese literary history was not composed by a court poet, not by a priest, not by an emperor. It was composed by a god who had spent his divine existence in grief and destruction, who had been punished and exiled and diminished, who had arrived at the bottom of everything, and then found at the bottom something worth building a fence to protect. World mythology. This transformation of Susanoo from destructive grief to protective creativity is one of the most psychologically sophisticated elements of Japanese mythology. It maps onto what contemporary grief researchers call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon whereby severe loss, if survived and metabolized, sometimes produces not just recovery, but genuine transformation, new capacities, new perspectives, new creativity. Susanoo does not simply recover from his grief, he is transformed by it. The energy that had gone into world-withering mourning becomes, in Izumo, the energy of poetry and protection. He settled in Izumo. He and Kushinada Jaime had descendants who became the great deities of the Izumo tradition, a lineage that runs through Okuninushi, one of the most important kami in the Shinto tradition, who would eventually rule the earth itself. Susanoo's exile, which had seemed like the end of everything, had become the seed of an entire mythological dynasty. The storm god was home. Chapter 4. Yamato Takeru, the Warrior and the Wound. Part 1. The Making of a Hero. The Age of the Legendary Emperors. We have moved in our story from the Age of Gods to the Age of Heroes. This transition is not sharp. Japanese mythology does not draw a clear line between the divine and the human, the way some traditions do. The legendary emperors are not mortal in the ordinary sense. They are descended from Amaterasu, connected to the divine, possessed of powers that exceed ordinary human capacity. But they exist in the world rather than above it. They interact with ordinary people. They can be hurt, deceived, exhausted. They die. The era of the legendary emperors is semi-historical territory. Modern scholars believe that the earliest emperors in the Kojiki are entirely mythological, that the middle emperors are perhaps based on real figures whose stories have been heavily mythologized, and that somewhere around the 4th or 5th century CE, the legendary record begins to overlap with actual history. Where Yamato Takeru falls in this spectrum is uncertain. He may be based on a real prince, a composite of several historical figures, or entirely invented. What is clear is that by the time the Kojiki was compiled, his story had the weight and the complexity of long oral tradition. He was the son of Emperor Keiko, the 12th legendary emperor. His mother's name is not emphasized in the Kojiki, a reflection of the patriarchal values of the court society that produced the text. He was the second son. His birth name was Usu no Mikoto, Prince Mortar. It is not a heroic name. It is the kind of name given before anyone knows who you are going to be. The killing in the bathroom, a character revealed. The story that defines Yamato Takeru comes before any of his famous adventures, before the Kumaso, before the Eastern Campaign, before the sword and the cave and the white bird. It comes in the most ordinary, domestic, almost absurd setting imaginable. A bathroom. Emperor Keiko had been expecting two unruly chieftains, brothers from a distant province, to come to the capital and eat at the imperial table. This was a ritual of submission, a political ceremony. You eat at the emperor's table. You acknowledge his authority over you. The brothers refused to come. They didn't come to the first meal or the second. Keiko sent his elder son to admonish them and bring them back. The elder son, apparently assessing the situation and finding it personally dangerous, never went. He hid. Keiko turned to his younger son, the 15-year-old Usu. He gave him the same instructions. Go find the brothers, admonish them, encourage them to fulfill their duties. The language is diplomatic, almost gentle. Gently admonish is the phrase. Bring them in. Usu went. 5 days passed. The brothers still didn't appear at the imperial table. A week passed. Keiko began to wonder, not about the brothers, but about his son. Was he all right? Had something happened? He sent for Usu and asked, carefully, "Have you met with the brothers? Are they coming?" Usu looked at his father with an expression that may have been entirely calm. "I have already dealt with them." "Dealt with them, but they haven't come to table. They won't be coming. On the first morning, I waited in the toilet for the elder brother. When he came in, I seized him and crushed him, and pulled his limbs off, and wrapped what was left in a straw mat and threw it away. The younger brother saw what had happened and was very frightened. He begged for mercy. He swore he would submit entirely. He promised anything. But I killed him too. There is a silence in the Kojiki at this point that you can feel across 13 centuries. Emperor Keiko, absolute ruler of Japan, direct descendant of Amaterasu, the 12th legendary emperor, had nothing to say. He had asked for gentle admonishment and received something that had no name yet in his experience. His 15-year-old son had waited in a toilet, disassembled the man, and reported it with the serenity of someone describing an administrative task completed successfully. The emperor was afraid of his own child. He sent Usu away almost immediately on the first, in what would become a series of increasingly dangerous missions. Some later commentators are generous about Keiko's motivations. Some suggest he was simply finding appropriate challenges for an extraordinary warrior, that the missions were gifts of purpose, not sentences of death. The Kojiki itself is less generous. It records that Keiko sent his son on missions without warmth, without preparation, often without adequate support, and that Yamato Takeru went to his aunt at Ise, weeping, because his father's court had never felt like home. The Kumaso brothers, the birth of a name. The Kumaso Takeru brothers were chieftains in Kyushu who had refused to submit to Yamato authority. They were not soft men. They were warriors of genuine power and genuine reputation, the kind of figures who generated legends of their own. Keiko sent his teenage son to deal with them, alone. Usu obtained women's clothing, silk robes, the kind worn by court ladies, from his aunt Yamato Hime, the high priestess of Ise, and transformed himself. He let his hair down. He dressed with care. He walked into the feast that the Kumaso brothers were throwing and took a seat among the serving women and waited. The disguise worked because it was good and because the Kumaso brothers were not expecting it. Why would a warrior from the Yamato court send a teenage girl to infiltrate their feast? The premise was so unlikely that it provided its own cover. But the elder Kumaso Takeru noticed this particular serving woman, noticed the quality of her attention, the stillness beneath the demure gestures, the eyes that were doing something more calculating than serving women's eyes typically did. He was drawn to her, as predators sometimes are to the things that are slightly wrong. Usu sat beside the elder brother at the feast. He ate with him, drank with him, maintained the fiction of the serving girl through the long hours of the celebration. And when the elder brother was drunk enough, when his reactions had slowed and his guard had come down to the level where it could not recover in time, Usu moved. He killed the elder Kumaso Takeru. The younger brother saw what had happened, understood immediately what he was dealing with, and ran. He ran for the entrance to the hall, and he almost made it. Usu caught him at the door and stabbed him through from behind. The younger Kumaso Takeru, dying, looked back at the figure standing over him, and he spoke. His dying words are one of the most interesting moments in Japanese mythology. A great warrior, at the moment of his death, recognizing greatness in his killer and deciding that the right thing to do with his final breath is to honor it. In the West and the East, he said, I have traveled, and I have known every warrior worth knowing. I have never met anyone like you. There is no one in the realm who surpasses you. Your bravery exceeds the bravest name I know, my own. From this day, I give you my name. I name you Yamato Takeru. And he died. The figure standing over him straightened. He had gone to Kyushu as Usu no Mikoto, Prince Mortar, the unremarkable second son of the 12th emperor, the boy his father couldn't keep at court. He came back as Yamato Takeru, Prince brave of Yamato, the mightiest warrior in the realm, a name given to him not by his father, but by the enemy he had just killed. A name earned in blood from the only judge whose judgment he couldn't dispute. Part 2. The Eastern Campaign sent away again. The visit to Ise. He returned from Kyushu, and his father sent him away again. The eastern provinces had not submitted. The Emishi, the people of northeastern Honshu and beyond, had their own leaders, their own culture, their own sense of what they owed to the Yamato court, which was nothing. They needed to be brought in. And once again, Keiko did not send an army. He sent his son, Yamato Takeru. Before beginning the Eastern Campaign, Yamato Takeru went to Ise, to his aunt Yamato Jaime, who served as the high priestess of the Grand Shrine, the representative of Amaterasu herself on earth. He went, the Kojiki tells us, weeping, not performing grief, not strategically mourning, genuinely, physically weeping. He said to his aunt, "My father must want me dead." When I came back from the Western Campaign, he did not meet with me. He did not ask about my journey. He did not express satisfaction at what I had accomplished. He simply sent me east. He must be hoping I don't come back. Yamato Hime listened. She did not tell him his father loved him, because the text gives no evidence that this was true. She did not minimize his grief or redirect his attention. She listened, and then she gave him two things. First, the Kusanagi sword. The sword Susanoo had found in the tail of Yamata no Orochi. The sword that had been offered to Amaterasu and kept at Ise ever since. A sword that had been in the world before humans had names for the things they feared. She placed it in her nephew's hands. Second, a small bag, sealed tightly, containing a flint and tinder. A fire-starting kit. When things become desperate, she said, use these. He took the sword and the bag. He bowed to his aunt. He walked east. Ototachibana, love and sacrifice. Among the companions who joined Yamato Takeru on the Eastern Campaign was a woman named Ototachibana Haim, Princess Ototachibana. She's not described in the Kojiki with great physical detail. The ancient text is generally sparse with physical description, but she is described in terms of her devotion. She chose to accompany Yamato Takeru into unknown territory, into danger, into a campaign with no guaranteed return. That choice itself is her characterization. They traveled together through the eastern provinces. The adventures accumulated, ambushes survived, chieftains subdued, territories brought into the Yamato order. And then they came to the sea. At a crossing, the Hashiramizu no Umi, the fast-running sea, an inlet that had to be crossed by boat. The water was peaceful when they embarked. Then it was not. A storm came up with the suddenness that the sea in Japan can produce, violent and without warning. The waves grew. The boat tossed. The crossing that had seemed straightforward became potentially lethal. Ototachibana looked at the sea. She said calmly, "The sea god is angry. This storm is not natural weather. It is a divine challenge to my lord. I will calm it." Before Yamato Takeru could stop her, before he could understand what she was proposing to do, she spoke to him. A poem, 3 lines, a farewell wrapped in an image. The way Japanese poetry wraps its most unbearable content in beauty, because unbearable content is otherwise unspeakable. She addressed him as my lord. She told him something about fire, about smoke, about herself. And then she stepped off the boat into the sea. The storm stopped immediately. The waves went flat. The sea became as still as a floor of polished stone, and the boat continued to the other shore, and Yamato Takeru stood at the prow and could not move. For 7 days after the crossing, the Kojiki says, he did not speak of anything else. He walked through the eastern provinces saying, "Azuma waya." Ah, my dear wife. Again and again, in the stunned repetition of someone whose mind cannot move past a single fact. Some scholars believe the name Azuma, the ancient Japanese name for the eastern provinces, derives from these words of mourning. The land itself, named after his grief. Scholars note, Ototachibana's self-sacrifice is understood in Shinto terms as chinkon, the pacification of an angry divine force through voluntary offering. The sea god's anger required appeasement, and Ototachibana chose to be that appeasement. Her action is not read as suicide in any simple sense, but as a sacred act, a deliberate participation in the cosmic order, giving something precious to restore balance. Several shrines in the Kanto region are associated with her memory. The burning grass, Kusanagi urns, its name, Yamato Takeru, continued east, carrying his grief alongside his mission. The victories accumulated. New territories, new submissions, new evidence of a warrior whose reputation now preceded him into lands he had never visited. But with the accumulating victories came something else. The dangerous confidence of a man who has never lost. One of the local chieftains, the Kojiki does not give his name, told Yamato Takeru that there was a great deer on the eastern plain, a supernatural deer, perhaps a god in animal form, a worthy quarry for the greatest warrior in the realm. He invited Yamato Takeru to come and hunt. It was a trap, the most simple kind. Lure the target into open ground and burn it. Yamato Takeru rode out onto the plain. The chieftain's men lit the dry grass at multiple points simultaneously, and the fire spread with the speed and purpose that dry season grass fire always has. Not a controlled burn, but a consuming conflagration, a ring of flame contracting inward from every direction at once. The smoke rose in thick black columns. The heat was already intense from 100 yards away. Yamato Takeru reached into his memory and found his aunt's voice. When things become desperate, he drew Kusanagi, the sacred sword from the tail of the Orochi, the sword that had waited inside a monster for ages. He began to cut, not in a circle. He couldn't cut fast enough to clear a large enough space by going in a circle. He cut in the direction from which the wind was blowing, mowing the grass down in a wide swath, creating a cleared corridor in the direction the fire was approaching from fastest. Then he opened the bag his aunt had given him. Flint, tinder. He lit the cut grass. His fire and the chieftain's fire met each other on the plain, and for a moment there was a wall of flame at the edge of the cleared space, a wall that burned in both directions simultaneously. Then the counter-fire, fed by Yamato Takeru's cleared corridor, raced back along the path he had created, toward the men who had set the original fire. The wind carried it. The dry grass fed it. The chieftain's men ran, but there was nowhere to go. Yamato Takeru walked out of the burned plain unscathed, the Kusanagi sword in his hand, which had cut the grass, the bag from his aunt, which had provided the counter-fire. From that day, the sword was called Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword. The name it carries today, the name under which it reposes at Atsuta Shrine, the name that appears in every account of the imperial regalia. A sword from the mythological age, named in a field, by a warrior who had learned something his father could never have taught him, that survival sometimes requires not fighting the fire, but understanding it. Part 3. The Fall of the Hero. The Pride Before. Mount Ibuki. On his return journey from the Eastern Campaign, rich with victories, Yamato Takeru stopped at the home of a woman named Miyazu-hime, whom he had promised to marry when he returned. He was received warmly. He rested. He made his intentions clear. And he heard from someone, perhaps from Miyazu-hime herself, perhaps from local people, of a troublesome god on nearby Mount Ibuki, a deity who had not submitted, a god of a mountain who remained outside the order that Yamato Takeru had spent years establishing, the greatest warrior in Japan, who had subdued the West and the East, who had faced monsters and ambushes, and the grief of loss, and emerged from all of it intact, looked at Mount Ibuki and made a decision that would prove fatal. He left Kusanagi with Miyazu-hime. He would not need the sacred sword for this. A mere earthly deity, a local mountain god. This was not a challenge worthy of the grass-cutting sword. He would deal with it as a matter of ordinary divine business. This decision, leaving the sword behind, has generated centuries of commentary and interpretation. Was it arrogance? Almost certainly. Was it exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that makes you cut corners even when you know better? Possibly. Was it grief, a longing for the campaign to be over, a carelessness born of having survived so much that he had stopped fully attending to the possibility of his own death? Perhaps all three. He climbed Mount Ibuki. On the path, he encountered a white boar, large, completely still, standing in the middle of the trail, watching him with eyes that were unnervingly calm. This must be a messenger of the mountain god, Yamato Takeru thought, and kept climbing. I'll deal with it on the way down. He did not stop to honor it. He did not make an offering. He did not treat it with the deference that divine or semi-divine presences require in the Shinto understanding. He walked past it. He kept going up the mountain toward whatever he thought he was going to face. The mountain responded, not with a monster, not with a demon, with hail. Massive, relentless hail falling out of a sky that had been clear an hour ago. The temperature dropped as if the mountain had decided to demonstrate what cold actually meant. The fog came in so thick that the path disappeared. Yamato Takeru's bearings vanished. Forward, back, up, down, all dissolved into gray and cold, and the sound of ice on stone. He descended the mountain. The Kojiki does not describe this descent in detail, perhaps because there is nothing heroic about it, perhaps because the warrior who came down was not the warrior who had gone up. He was confused. His mind wandered. He sat down at a spring and drank the water, and the cold water in his mouth was one of the few things that felt real. He was ill in a way he had never been ill. Not wounded. There was no wound. Something more fundamental had broken. Scholar's note. The white boar on Mount Ibuki is understood by most scholars as the mountain god itself in disguised form, or as its messenger, which in Shinto terms amounts to the same thing. Yamato Takeru's failure to recognize it and respond appropriately was his fatal transgression. In Shinto thought, divine presences that are not properly acknowledged do not simply go unnoticed. They become dangerous. The mountain god that Yamato Takeru dismissed as a mere earthly deity turned out to be exactly the kind of power that no sword, however sacred, could have cut. The long dying, poems at every stop. What followed is one of the most poignant passages in all of Japanese literature. Yamato Takeru moved south and west, back toward his homeland of Yamato, the region around modern Nara, but he could not move quickly anymore. Something in him was broken, and it was breaking further with each day. He stopped wherever he could, at springs, at hilltops, at any place where a person in pain might find a moment of rest or a moment of beauty. And at each stopping place, he composed a poem. He was not trained as a poet. He was a warrior. His skills were physical. His gifts were those of the body and the battle. But in the approach of death, something opened in him that had been closed for a long time. The poems that came out were not warriors' boasts or divine proclamations. They were the words of a man who had never been given permission to simply love where he came from, who had spent his entire short life moving away from home on other people's orders, and who was dying without ever having been allowed to stay. At a spring near Nobo, he stopped to drink and spoke. "Oh, the water at Nobo. This is the water I drink in small sips, having been so long away. An ordinary act, drinking from a spring, made luminous by the consciousness of absence. He has been away too long. The water tastes like what he has missed." He continued, weaker with each mile, At a place called Koto, he stopped to rest against a pine tree, leaning his weight into its trunk, feeling the rough bark against his back. And he addressed the tree. "Oh, pine tree at Koto, if you were a person, I would dress you in a sword and court robes. How I value you, my friend, pine tree." A warrior addressing a tree as a friend, in the absence of any human friend to address. The image is almost unbearable. He has spent his life fighting, and at the end of it, the only companion he has is a tree. He composed a poem about the sword he had left behind, the sword that might have saved him if he had only thought to keep it. He composed a poem about the food of Yamato, about the flavors of home that he would not taste again. And finally, from a hill from which he could just see the distant mountains of Yamato, the beautiful mountains folded together, encircled with blue peaks, he sang his most famous poem, the poem about his homeland, the poem that says Yamato is the finest of all lands, the most beautiful, the most beloved, a poem of such pure homecoming grief that it has been recited, taught, and treasured in Japan for 13 centuries. He could see the mountains. He could not reach them. The distance between him and home was too much for what was left in him. He died at a place called Nobono, in what is now Mie Prefecture, beside the road he had been walking toward the mountains he could see. He was young. The Kojiki does not give his age, but everything in his story suggests a man who died before 30. The greatest warrior Japan had ever known, victor over serpents and chieftains and burning plains, died by a road in a prefecture he had never meant to stop in, looking toward mountains he had always been leaving. The white bird, an ending that is not an ending. And then, what happened? What the ancient storytellers needed to happen, what every tradition that has ever tried to make sense of a death too young and too unjust has needed to find. Something that goes beyond the ordinary ending. His soul left his body in the form of a great white bird. Not a small bird, not a songbird, but a great bird of pure and brilliant white. A swan, or an eagle, or something that had no name, because it existed only in this moment. It rose from the place where he had fallen, and it flew east toward the sea. His family and his retainers, who had been following him for days, trying to support him, trying to be useful in the face of something that could not be helped. They saw the bird rise, and they ran after it. They ran through the sea when it flew over the water, wading in up to their thighs, composing poems of grief as they went. They stumbled through the tall grass fields when it flew low overhead. One by one, as the bird flew further and the terrain became more difficult, they fell behind. The bird did not descend. It flew on, east along the coast, then south, then up, higher and higher, the white shape against the blue sky growing smaller, becoming a point, becoming nothing, gone. And that is, in a mythological sense, exactly right. The story cannot end with a body beside a road. Yamato Takeru's story cannot end with defeat and loss, and the absence of the father's love he never received. It has to go somewhere. The white bird is the answer, not a denial of the death, but a transformation of it. He does not survive, but he does not simply stop. He becomes something the living world can still feel, still reach toward, something that flew on beyond the boundary of what can be followed. Modern Japan. Shiratori Shrine, Whitebird Shrine, exists at several locations in Japan, each one said to be built where the whitebird paused in its flight before finally ascending beyond sight. The shrines in Aichi and Osaka prefectures both claim this connection. Yamato Takeru is worshipped as a divine figure at these shrines, not simply remembered as a legendary hero, but actively venerated as a kami, a divine presence that continues to be felt in the world. He is, in the fullest Shinto sense, not gone. He has simply become invisible. Conclusion: the living mythology of Japan. We began in darkness, a formless void, the universe not yet sorted into the things that constitute a world. We end here in the 21st century, in a Japan that is simultaneously one of the most technologically sophisticated societies on Earth, and one of the most continuous. A civilization that has never entirely let go of its oldest stories. Let me tell you what has remained. The grand shrine of Ise, dedicated to Amaterasu, the most sacred site in Shinto, still stands on the bank of the Isuzu River in Mie Prefecture. It receives 8 million pilgrims and visitors each year. It was rebuilt most recently in 2013, and it will be rebuilt again in 2033, as it has been rebuilt every 20 years for over 13 centuries. The ritual is called Shikinen Sengu, and it involves the construction of an entirely new shrine complex. Every beam, every plank of sacred cypress, every object on the adjacent plot of land that has been kept vacant for exactly this purpose. When the new shrine is complete, the divine presence is transferred from old to new in a ceremony conducted in complete darkness. The old shrine is then dismantled, its sacred wood distributed to other shrines across Japan. Then the empty plot waits again for 20 years, when the cycle will begin once more. The Shikanen Sengu is one of the most powerful religious ceremonies in the world, not because of its scale, though its scale is considerable, but because of what it means. It says nothing should last forever. Renewal is not failure, it is faithfulness. The shrine is not maintained by preserving it unchanged. It is maintained by destroying and rebuilding it perfectly, again and again and again. The form persists. The material transforms. This is, when you think about it, exactly what myth does. The story persists. The telling transforms. The three imperial treasures are still the sacred symbols of the Japanese throne. At the accession of a new emperor, most recently in 2019, when Emperor Naruhito formally ascended after his father Emperor Akihito's abdication, the mirror, the jewel, and the sword are presented as part of the ceremony that transfers divine legitimacy. The mirror and the jewel were present in the accession ceremony. The sword, kept at Atsuta Shrine, was represented by a replica. These objects have never been publicly displayed, never been photographed. Their physical forms are unknown even to the priests who tend them. They exist at the center of Japanese civilization as objects that are known about, written about, revered, and never seen. The unseen thing, the thing behind the veil, the divine presence that is felt but not observed. This is a Shinto category, and the imperial treasures embody it completely. The high river still flows through Shimane Prefecture with a reddish tint in its water, and there are still people who will tell you, with complete seriousness, or with a smile that doesn't entirely deny the seriousness, that the color comes from the blood of Yamata no Orochi, spilled when Susanoo cut it into pieces at the headwaters of the river in the Age of the Gods. Kagura dance, the sacred dance tradition that traces its origin to Ame no Uzume dancing outside Heaven's Rock Cave, is still performed at Shinto shrines throughout Japan, particularly in the autumn festival season. It has evolved over the centuries into dozens of regional styles, some solemn, some comedic, some theatrical, all of them connected by the underlying mythological story of a goddess dancing to bring light back to the world. If you visit Japan in October or November and you look for it, you will find it. The drums, the masks, the ancient stories told through movement, performed under the open sky of shrine precincts as they have been performed for well over 1,000 years. And in the language itself, every Japanese person who says yaoyorozu, 8 million things, the phrase for an uncountable multitude, is using the number of gods who gathered at Ame no Yasukawara when Amaterasu hid herself. The word kami itself, which appears in the names of deities, in place names, in surnames, in the word for paper, kami, in the word for hair, kami, in the compound that gives us samurai, is everywhere in the Japanese language, and its presence is a continuous, if often unnoticed, echo of the mythological tradition we have been exploring today. This is what a living mythology looks like. It is not museum culture, not academic study only, not the exclusive province of priests and scholars. It is woven into daily life at a level below conscious attention, in the ceremonies people participate in the language they speak, in the shrines they pass on the way to the station, in the New Year's prayers, and the wedding rituals and the harvest festivals, and the way a gnarled old tree wrapped in a sacred rope commands a moment of quiet from almost anyone who notices it. Japan is not a mythological society in the way that some ancient civilizations were, where the myths were the operating system, where everything was understood through divine narrative. It is a modern, secular in practice society, where the mythology exists as an undercurrent, available to those who look for it, felt even by those who don't. The myths are not lost. They are not even sleeping. They are simply present in the way that anything that has been part of a culture for long enough becomes part of its texture, invisible until you know to look for it, and then everywhere. I hope that after today, you know to look for it. What we have covered today is, I want to be honest with you, a beginning. Japanese mythology is vast. We have told the stories of the creation, of Amaterasu and Susanoo, of Yamato Takeru. We have not told the stories of Okuninushi, the great kami who ruled the earth and built a kingdom of extraordinary diversity and richness before surrendering it to the will of heaven in a negotiation that is one of the most politically sophisticated passages in ancient world literature. We have not told the stories of Urashima Taro, the fisherman who descends to the palace of the sea god and returns to find that centuries have passed in the space of an afternoon. We have not explored the world of the Japanese dragon, the Ryu, or the fox deity Inari, and the armies of fox spirits that serve as divine messengers across the landscape. We have not visited the specific mythology of Okinawa or the Ainu traditions of Hokkaido, which exist alongside the Yamato mythological tradition with their own richness and their own claims on the land. There's so much more, and I intend to keep telling it. If there is a specific myth, a specific deity, a specific aspect of the Shinto tradition that you would like to see explored in a future video, please let me know in the comments. This community's curiosity is what makes these videos possible, and I read everything. If you want to go deeper on your own, I recommend starting with Donald Philippi's translation of the Kojiki. The Penguin Classics Edition is the most accessible. For Japanese mythology, in its broader cultural context, Juliet Pigot's Japanese Mythology is an excellent survey. And W. G. Aston's 1896 translation of the Nihon Shoki, though old, remains a valuable resource and is freely available online. Thank you for spending this time with these stories. They have been told for over 1,000 years, and they deserve to be told for 1,000 more. Until next time.